Hello and good day, Prime Minister Trudeau. A recent video was too long, so I broke it into two sections. One was 30 minutes and one was 20 minutes. These videos explained how I was internationally human and sex trafficked and brought to Nova Scotia by one of my childhood rapists in April of 2017. It explains how I was held for 2 years with the simple threat that they would murder my Uncle Larry, who has Huntington's, if I left or told anyone. I explained that my 3 childhood rapists were in an ongoing decades-long war over who would have to do the other one's housework, and that it escalated exponentially with my forced involvement. With all of the tortures being done to me as punishment, I was held by the threat. Everything else was punishment for not doing what I was told, or as leverage to try to force me to do something by hurting another member of my family. I explained that after an initial and prolonged loss, Wilhelmina was driven to suicide by the tortures that both of her daughters were visiting on her, and that my refusal to participate in torturing Wilhelmina in that fashion led to Roseanne Williams beating me into internal bleeding. I had blood in my urine and my feces by July of 2017 as my health spiraled. I explained that in late July or early August I was so close to death from everything that was happening that Roseanne let me go. She ordered me out of her house, she ordered me out of the country, she ordered me not to return and not to tell anyone what had happened. I had arranged job interviews in Toronto for the last week of April before I arrived in Canada. Roseanne had never let me attend them. I was never allowed to leave Beach Meadows. I kept in contact by email with several employers and would pursue opportunities each month in the hopes that Roseanne would release me. In July of 2017, one of those jobs overlapped with Roseanne indicating that I would be released soon if I agreed to leave the country and never tell anyone anything. Roseanne was blunt about wanting me to die overseas and not in her house. The job I was pursuing was in Mexico. It was an IB-styled school which matched the training and the job that I originally wanted to pursue in Canada. Immigration records will show that I flew to Mexico in early August of 2017. It was my intention to stay, but my health was worse than when I had arrived in Canada only 4 months earlier, and I was unable to perform the basic tasks required of the job. I was forced to give up the job in Mexico and return to Canada in early October. Immigration records will also show this. I was forced to give up the job in Mexico for the same reasons and in the same way that I was forced to give up the job in Taiwan earlier the same year. I arrived in Halifax in October of 2017 and rented a private room at a local hostel for the winter, something that I had done around the world for decades when I wanted a vacation. It was something that I had done in Canada before, from Nova Scotia to British Columbia. My lease that year was until April or May of 2018, when tourist season would return and my room would be shifted back to a nightly rental with a stay limit of 2 weeks. Roseanne Williams stalked me in Halifax that entire winter. There is not a single phone call, not a single email, not a single message between Roseanne and I for that time frame. Yet I gave the RCMP a series of Facebook messages from me to my siblings, telling them to relay information to Roseanne to show that she had been in Halifax and in contact with me all winter long. I did this to leave evidence of the radically different story Roseanne was telling. In my absence, Karen and Wilhelmina were torturing Roseanne even more viciously. Roseanne, resorting to increased isolation and increasing violence, was having another major mental breakdown. She would show up in Halifax at the hostel almost every weekend. She still had to work weekdays, but she came almost every weekend, and at the end of the day to find a series of verbal messages she had left at the front desk. Sometimes she would find me once, or sometimes she would find me twice. Either experience was the same. Roseanne was never allowed into the hostel proper, never allowed anywhere near my room or my apartment. I would only allow her to stay in the common room, where she would have to speak more or less in public. She would whisper and whimper and sob and cry during these visits. She would cry and explain how much worse it was now that I was gone, how much worse it was now that Karen and Wilhelmina were the ones beating Larry and beating Dennis, which I didn't believe. Wilhelmina and Karen weren't physically capable of doing it, and both of them prided themselves on torturing Roseanne until she beat Dennis and Larry. But I did believe that things got worse, because Roseanne was clearly having a major mental breakdown. She would cry and explain that she needed to escape, that she needed my help to escape, the way I had helped Karen escape Roseanne and Wilhelmina in the 90s and 2000s. Another of many details that I don't have time to explain. Each weekend as she came to the Halifax stalking me, she would find me, cry, and explain that she wanted to finish her yoga instructor training license, that she was specializing in yoga for children with special needs, as she had specialized in students with special needs as a teacher, both through her license and through her master's degrees. I believe she has 2 of those. Roseanne would cry and explain that she hadn't been able to finish the hours for the yoga license because Larry had gotten sick in 2016, and then he had been in a coma, and then he had been in physio, and then it took too much for Roseanne to look after him. Roseanne would cry and explain that she wanted to move Larry to the Manor, a full-time assisted living environment in Liverpool, so that she could retire and move to Indonesia. She was specific about the country. She would cry and explain that her oldest son would come live with her, that he would take care of her for the rest of her life, and she would financially take care of him for the rest of his life. Roseanne seemed oblivious to wanting exactly the life her mother had with her brother. Roseanne would cry and beg me to come back to Beach Meadows to watch Larry while she left the country. She would explain that there were yoga retreats all over the world that would count towards her hours, and all winter long, Roseanne cried and promised to leave the country if I would come watch Larry for a couple of weeks while she finished her license. And all winter long, my answer was no. But it ate away at me. My refusal to help in Vietnam ended in a child's death. My refusal in Beach Meadows almost caused Wilhelmina's suicide. My refusal at any moment could cost Larry his life. I had no doubt that Roseanne would beat him to death eventually. During this winter, Roseanne's threats were veiled more than usual and deflected more than usual, with her claiming that Karen and Wilhelmina had shifted to the ones that would beat Larry and beat Dennis, which I knew not to be true. Each time Roseanne visited, she left details. She did this on purpose, knowing that I would check them because she knows what I used to do for a living, and I did check them. And her claims about yoga licensing for children with special needs, with international yoga retreats whose hours counted towards Canadian licensing, it all existed. Whether she was part of it or not was another matter. Roseanne had frequently attended yoga sessions and retreats in Nova Scotia, but none of them seemed to count towards her hours for her license. She said it was because she was a student, and these retreats were for her to be a teacher. Over this winter, I was short-cycling my medications, taking the maximum dosage at the minimum interval. I hadn't filed my taxes or applied for health care because it was my intention to leave as soon as I could pass medicals. There's a public clinic on Spring Garden in Roby that helped me during this time. It was $100 a visit, but they would do everything that I asked them to do and didn't charge me more than the $100 visitation fee. My salary from Mexico was disappearing quite quickly that winter, and my meds would run out by summer. I had bought them in April of the previous year, and they should have run out in April of 2018, but I got a few more months out of them because I wasn't allowed to take them for an entire summer. In February of 2018, I finally gave in and agreed to watch Larry for 2 weeks if Roseanne was out of the country. This is one of the messages that I sent to my siblings, to let them know that I would be looking after Larry while Roseanne was out of the country. It was all lies. Roseanne never left the country. For 2 weeks in February, Roseanne would only scream at her mother and her sister in her mother's kitchen as all 3 of them tore each other apart at every meal with all of the tortures that all of them had perfected over their lifetimes, and especially over the last year when I was looking after Larry. Every night, Roseanne would wait until Larry was long asleep, coming home hours and hours after he'd taken his pills, so that she could sit on the couch and cry and beg for me to stay longer, because she'd had to move her international retreat from February to her March break, because she'd found out at the last minute that Larry couldn't go into long-term respite, which is where you stay at the manor for weeks but not permanently, until he had done at least a few weeks of their daycare program. The daycare program was for outside clients to come to the manor from between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. 3 days a week as part of an evaluation process to see if they would be a good fit for the manor and to evaluate their physical violence. The fact that none of it made sense didn't matter. The fact that I was supposed to watch Larry while Roseanne exited the country for one time, for one yoga retreat, didn't matter. Roseanne would only cry and sob and beg that I stay and take care of Larry and take him to the day program 3 days a week for 2 weeks starting in March, so that Roseanne could put him in long-term respite every time she wanted to leave the country. And that the first chance she would get to leave the country was March break. I went to the manor. I spoke to the people responsible for these programs. I checked that all this information was true. It was true, but that doesn't guarantee that Roseanne was part of it. I said no every day, but it wore me down the way Vietnam did. It wore me down the way Wilhelmina's attempted suicide did. It wore me down because at any moment, Larry could be beaten to death. I could be beaten to death. It would only take one accident for one of us to be killed. And in the end, I agreed, and that was a mistake. I returned to Halifax at the end of February. I closed out my apartment and returned to Beach Meadows at the beginning of March. And everything went to hell instantly. My first day back, I was called to Wilhelmina's because Roseanne was killing Dennis. I found the same situations I'd always had. Roseanne was screaming and beating Dennis, who was shielding Larry. Roseanne was screaming that Larry was faking his Huntingtons and that Dennis was helping Jeffrey secretly and he wasn't allowed. Wilhelmina was screaming all of her tortures at Roseanne. Karen was whispering all of her tortures at Roseanne, which forced Roseanne to lean in and listen to what Karen would say, which only made her angrier. It was all lies, it was all violence, nothing had changed. And the first time I mentioned the Manor Day program, the respite program, to Roseanne, at the dinner table, in front of everyone, the first time I reminded Roseanne that she was supposed to leave the country, that I was supposed to look after Larry while she was in Mexico at a yoga retreat, Roseanne would only scream and beat me harder, screaming that I was lying, screaming that she couldn't afford to put Larry in the manor full time, because they would add both of their incomes together and they would take half. Roseanne would scream every night she couldn't afford to put Larry in the manor because Larry's pension was half of what hers was. So when they added them together and then took half of the total, they would take all of her money. For the month of March in 2018, I was beaten at every meal. Sodomy started at the very beginning of March, and Roseanne never let up. She never let up about the manor being a lie. She never let up about the international travel being a lie. She never let up about Mexico being a lie. She screamed in great detail that her boys were coming home in August to see their father one last time before he went into the manor full time. That Jeffrey was staying until then to look after Larry. That once the boys were gone, and before Larry went into the manor, Roseanne would scream her explanation to her family that she had power of attorney, that she would transfer all of Larry's assets to her name, that she would divorce Larry and put him in the manor only when the government could only take his pension. And when that was done, when Roseanne had stolen all of her marital assets and put Larry in the manor, only then would she retire and move overseas, although she never specified what country she would live in or how her oldest son would be involved. The first few times Roseanne explained her great plan, I'd remind her she still needed him in respite, that was why I was here, that I was supposed to take him to respite every day, and I would ask at supper each night why I wasn't taking him to respite the next day. Roseanne would beat me with silverware from her rocking chair, as she always had, for the last year, and from the lower legs, my lower back, or my buttocks. And at the beginning of March of 2018, Roseanne Williams sodomized me with silverware for the first time, likely by accident, as it had never happened before. The handle of one of her pieces of flatware went inside me, right up to her hand as a hilt. She pulled it out and dropped it. Karen and Wilhelmina smiled and laughed. Dennis and Tammy hadn't seen anything, because they had long since adopted staring into their plates of food and not eating or not looking up. They would only listen to my beating before starting their own meal. And the signal to start eating was when the beating stopped and I sat down. Every night was Roseanne screaming in her own kitchen, a carbon copy of her mother, screaming her chronological order of 4 generations of sexual abuses, while screaming she'd kill Larry if I left or said anything, screaming that I had to stay until her sons came home in August. Every day, under the threat that Larry would be killed if I didn't go, I was forced into Wilhelmina's kitchen, where she would sit in her chair and pound on the arm of her recliner, or, her health allowing, she would stand at her table and pound on her table, screaming at me that she, Wilhelmina, not Roseanne, was responsible for Larry and Dennis's beatings every day. That what was done to me, that was the phrase Wilhelmina would use. She would smile and laugh, but she couldn't say the word rape. She couldn't say the word sodomy. She would only scream that what Roseanne did to me, that Wilhelmina had done that. Wilhelmina would brag about torturing Roseanne until Roseanne did what she did to me. And every day Wilhelmina would scream her particular catchphrase, referring to all of the violence and sexual abuse and now sodomy. That this is how I do things, because this is how I get things done. Twice a week I was forced into Karen's home as well, so that she could do the exact same thing. Roseanne had a pathological need to stand in her kitchen and scream and threaten. Wilhelmina had a pathological need to stand in her own kitchen and scream and threaten. And Karen had a pathological need to stand in her own kitchen and scream and threaten. Karen didn't have a kitchen table or chairs. She was forced to stand at her counter and beat on it while she screamed that she, Karen, not Roseanne, not Wilhelmina, that Karen was the one torturing everyone, that Karen was the one responsible for Roseanne beating Larry, that Karen was the one responsible for Roseanne beating Dennis, that Karen was responsible for what Roseanne did to me. Karen, like her mother, couldn't say the words either. She would only smile and laugh and scream at me. You know what Roseanne does to you every day. It can't be that bad or you'd call the RCMP. That was Karen's goal. That was the only reason she was doing any of this. She was raping and mutilating her own son through her sister, screaming she wouldn't stop until her son called the RCMP.